Stop scrolling. Because if even half of what Joe Rogan hinted at is true, then the story you thought you knew about Charlie and Erika just fell apart in real time. This isn't gossip. This isn't tabloids. This is one of those moments where the warning signs were right there on camera, in public, hiding in plain sight, and everyone collectively chose to look the other way. Until now, because on his latest podcast, Joe Rogan didn't whisper. He didn't hedge. He didn't play neutral referee. He flat out suggested that something about Erika's behavior around Charlie was off. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pauses, the mood swings, the sudden tension when certain topics came up, the way Charlie's energy seemed to drain month by month while the cameras kept rolling. Coincidence? Stress? Or something more calculated? Joe didn't accuse. He didn't diagnose. But he did what he does best. He asked the questions everyone else was too scared to ask. And those questions lit the internet on fire. Were the red flags obvious all along? Did Charlie know something was wrong but feel trapped? And why is Joe Rogan choosing now to speak up with that tone, that urgency, that "I've seen this before" energy? Buckle up. Because if this really was an unfolding warning story, then the timeline is about to get very uncomfortable. Joe Rogan didn't wake up one morning and randomly decide to say Erika's name out loud. That's the this video people keep missing. Joe has ignored dozens of internet scandals, skipped over trending meltdowns, and stayed quiet when entire timelines were screaming for commentary. So when he leaned forward on his podcast and started talking about Charlie's final stretch of life with that slow, deliberate tone, people who know Joe felt it immediately. This wasn't entertainment. This was concern that had been sitting in his chest for a long time. And the moment he said the words, the warning signs were clear, everything shifted. Because once you rewind the timeline, the picture starts forming whether people like it or not. Charlie didn't just change. He didn't suddenly become tired, distracted, or overwhelmed for no reason. The shift was gradual, visible, and painfully consistent. Early interviews show a man who was sharp, confident, controlled. But as months passed, something in him dulled. His pauses grew longer. His jokes landed flatter. His eyes wandered when certain topics came up, especially when questions drifted toward home, family, or support systems. And standing beside him, always perfectly composed, was Erika. Joe didn't accuse her of anything criminal. That's important. What he did was far more unsettling. He talked about patterns. He talked about emotional atmospheres. He talked about how some people don't have to raise their voice to dominate a room. They just have to control the temperature. According to Joe, every clip he revisited showed the same thing. Charlie shrinking while Erika expanded. Not loudly. Not aggressively, subtly, through timing, through silence, through reactions that didn't match the moment. People online tried to brush it off at first. Marriage is complicated. Politics are stressful. Public life eats people alive. But then others started pulling clips, side-by-side comparisons. Early Charlie versus late Charlie. Before and after energy that couldn't be explained away by work alone. In one viral moment, Charlie is mid-sentence, confident, rolling through a point, when Erika shifts in her seat. Not dramatically, just enough. Charlie clocks it instantly. His sentence trails off. He redirects. His shoulders tense. Joe paused that clip on his show and said something that made the room go quiet. That's not fear of the audience. That's fear of consequence. That line detonated across social media. Because fear of consequence implies history. It implies patterns behind closed doors. And that's where the whispers come in. Anonymous staffers, event coordinators, donors who asked not to be named. People who said Charlie was constantly checking his phone, constantly adjusting plans last minute, constantly apologizing for things that didn't make sense. One source claimed Charlie once canceled a meeting not because of scheduling conflicts, but because it wasn't a good day, not a bad day for work, a bad day at home. Joe also brought up something most people overlooked entirely. Erika's public persona never cracked. Not once. No visible stress. No visible strain. While Charlie looked like he was carrying a weight that was slowly crushing him, Erika looked untouched by the pressure. Always calm. Always in control. Always perfectly aware of where cameras were. Joe said that imbalance bothered him more than any rumor ever could. Because when one person is unraveling and the other looks completely untouched, that's not partnership. That's asymmetry. Then came the stories people were too uncomfortable to repeat until Joe said them first. That Erika had a way of reframing reality. That arguments weren't loud, but circular. That Charlie would walk into rooms confident and walk out doubting himself. That he began second-guessing conversations he'd already had. That he stopped confiding in friends because it just wasn't worth the fallout. Joe described it as psychological erosion. No explosion, no scandalous blow-up, just constant pressure until the ground gives way, and the most damning detail wasn't even something Joe heard directly. It was something he noticed on video. In Charlie's final months, anytime Erika was mentioned by name, Charlie's breathing changed. His cadence shifted. His answers shortened. Joe said he'd seen that response before in people dealing with controlling environments. Not abusive in the obvious sense. Abusive in the slow, invisible way that makes the victim look unstable to outsiders while the source looks perfectly reasonable. At this point, defenders rushed in. They accused Joe of reading too much into nothing, of projecting, of stirring drama. But Joe didn't escalate. He simply asked why so many people around Charlie had the same uneasy feeling. Why multiple insiders described the same emotional fog. Why Charlie reportedly told at least one friend, "I don't feel like myself anymore," without being able to explain why. And why, in the final stretch, Charlie seemed less afraid of public backlash than of disappointing someone at home. That's when Joe said something that changed the direction of the entire conversation. He said the warning signs weren't just visible in hindsight. They were visible in real time. People just didn't want to acknowledge them because acknowledging them would mean admitting that something dark can hide behind a polished image. And just as listeners were processing that, Joe hinted there was more he hadn't said yet, more context he hadn't shared. Moments that suggested Erika's influence wasn't just emotional but strategic. And that the pressure Charlie was under didn't come from the public at all but from somewhere far closer. Somewhere he couldn't escape, somewhere that followed him home and waited for him to sit down. And that's where the real story actually begins. And once you accept that the pressure wasn't coming from the crowd, the donors, or the critics, the next layer becomes impossible to ignore. Because according to people who were actually around Charlie during that period, the stress followed him everywhere. Not just on stage, not just online. It followed him into green rooms, into cars, into private conversations that were never meant to be public. Multiple anonymous sources told the same story using different words. Charlie wasn't panicking. He was bracing, like someone waiting for the next correction, the next emotional audit, the next moment where he'd have to explain himself for something he didn't even realize he'd done wrong. Joe Rogan leaned into that idea hard. He said this wasn't about shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. This was about constant monitoring, about subtle accountability that never shut off. One former staffer claimed Charlie would rehearse phone calls before making them, worried about how they'd sound if repeated back to him later. Another claimed Charlie would delay announcing decisions until he could clear the mood at home first. Not approval, mood. That distinction matters because approval suggests partnership. Mood suggests survival, and then there were the incidents no one could fully explain at the time. Meetings Charlie skipped at the last minute. Appearances he backed out of despite being fully prepared. One organizer said Charlie arrived at an event energized, confident, ready to go, then received a single message and completely shut down. Same clothes, same room, different person. Joe paused after sharing that detail and asked a question that rattled listeners. What kind of message has the power to override a grown man's public responsibilities instantly? That's where the whispers about isolation started to surface. Friends Charlie used to lean on said they stopped hearing from him as often, not because of distance, but because conversations felt complicated. One person described it as if Charlie was constantly weighing whether talking would create more problems than staying silent. Joe said that's not what ambition looks like. That's what emotional containment looks like. When someone starts shrinking their world to avoid reactions, something is wrong. Publicly, Erika remained composed. Calm interviews, controlled messaging, no visible cracks, and that contrast kept coming up. People noticed that whenever Charlie appeared tense or distracted, Erika appeared serene. When he stumbled over words, she appeared grounded. Joe suggested that dynamic wasn't accidental. In fact, it might have been essential. Because when one person destabilizes quietly while the other appears stable, outsiders naturally assume the unstable one is the problem. Then came the accounts that pushed this from uncomfortable to alarming. A source claimed Erika had a habit of reframing Charlie's concerns as personal flaws. If he expressed exhaustion, it became a lack of gratitude. If he expressed doubt, it became weakness. If he expressed discomfort, it became betrayal. Over time, Charlie reportedly stopped using emotional language altogether. He switched to neutral terms: logistics, scheduling, strategy, anything that avoided triggering a reaction. Joe called it a red flag you only recognize once you've seen it destroy someone. The internet started filling in gaps on its own. Old clips resurfaced where Erika finished Charlie's sentences, corrected him publicly, or subtly redirected conversations. Things that once looked like confidence suddenly looked like control. And the more people rewatched, the more they noticed how often Charlie deferred. How often he checked in with her eyes before answering. How often he laughed off moments that clearly unsettled him. Joe said people confuse composure with innocence far too often. Then came the anonymous messages Joe admitted he'd been receiving for months. Not fans, not trolls. People claiming proximity. People saying the same phrase over and over again. Something's not right. She has more influence than you think. Charlie isn't okay. Joe said he ignored them at first because speculation without proof is noise. But after Charlie's death, those messages changed tone. People stopped hinting. They started confessing, saying they wished they'd spoken sooner, saying they didn't know how without sounding crazy. One message stuck with Joe enough that he repeated it verbatim. He wasn't afraid of losing his platform. He was afraid of what would happen at home if he pushed back. That line reframed everything. Because fear of losing relevance is public. Fear of consequences at home is private. And private fear doesn't leave receipts unless someone's looking closely. At this point, critics accused Joe of spinning narratives, of diagnosing a relationship from afar, of exploiting tragedy. Joe responded the only way he knows how. He slowed down and explained that he wasn't drawing conclusions. He was pointing out warning signs, the kind that get ignored until it's too late, the kind that people excuse because the people involved look successful, put together, respectable. Joe said the most dangerous situations are the ones that look functional on the surface, and just when the conversation felt heavy enough, Joe hinted at something darker. He said there were moments Charlie described that didn't sound like normal marital conflict at all. Moments where Erika seemed to react to things Charlie hadn't said out loud. Moments where she appeared to anticipate his doubts before he voiced them. Moments where he felt managed rather than supported. Joe didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The implication alone sent speculation into overdrive, because if Charlie wasn't just responding to emotional tension but to a system of pressure he couldn't name, then this wasn't about personality clashes. It was about control structures, about who sets reality and who adapts to it. Joe said the scariest this video wasn't that Charlie felt trapped. It was that he didn't know when it happened. He just woke up one day feeling smaller than he used to, quieter than he used to, and unsure of how he got there. And as Joe let that sink in, he dropped the line that bridged everything into the final stage of the story. He said when people finally realize they're being shaped instead of supported, they usually do one of two things. They leave quietly, or they start asking questions. And according to Joe, Charlie had just started asking questions when everything unraveled. And that's when the true unraveling began. Because once Charlie started asking questions, once he tried to assert himself, the system he'd been unknowingly trapped in reacted almost instantly. According to Joe's sources, the tension in Charlie's life escalated faster than anyone could track. Private conversations that used to feel safe suddenly became mines. He tried to clarify simple matters: a missed call, an unexpected message, a sudden change in Erika's schedule. Each time, the response wasn't denial or explanation, it was redirection, subtle intimidation, and carefully crafted guilt. Joe described it as a psychological chess game, and Charlie was already 3 moves behind. Whispers from anonymous insiders suggested that Erika's behavior wasn't just reactive, it was rehearsed, conditioned, weaponized. Every defensive gesture, every careful smile, every "I didn't mean that" was designed to destabilize him, while simultaneously keeping her own conscience intact. Joe said it was chilling to hear about the way Charlie began documenting everything, secretly recording conversations and keeping notes no one else would see. He wasn't paranoid. He was strategizing. And that's when the leaks began to emerge. Little snippets, small indications, almost invisible patterns that hinted at a controlling force far beyond normal marital dynamics. The public, of course, had no idea. To them, Erika remained composed. Smiles, polished appearances, interviews filled with confidence and poise. But behind closed doors, Charlie described constant fear, not for his career, not for his reputation, but for his own autonomy. Every small act of defiance, every attempt to confront Erika about inconsistencies was met with subtle threats disguised as concern. Joe called it psychological engineering, shaping behavior through fear, obligation, and the illusion of choice. Then came the first whistleblowers. Staffers who had witnessed interactions firsthand started messaging Joe, confirming what he suspected. One anonymous text read, "He's controlling her, and she's controlling him. Or maybe we're all controlled." Another said, "Charlie isn't failing. He's being dismantled." Patterns emerged. Calls recorded at odd hours. Messages deleted. Mysterious visitors. A network of subtle manipulations that even seasoned insiders had trouble piecing together. Joe said it was as if someone had created a living blueprint for dismantling a person while maintaining plausible deniability for everyone involved. As the narrative expanded, so did the scale. Joe revealed that Erika's communications weren't just random chatter, they were monitored, timed, and sometimes edited in a way that kept Charlie off balance. Staffers described moments where Charlie would rehearse explanations for conversations that never actually happened, just to prevent future accusations. Every misstep, every hesitation, every slight misunderstanding became evidence of his own inadequacy in the eyes of the orchestrator behind Erika. Joe insisted it wasn't speculation. These accounts were consistent, corroborated, and detailed enough to paint a chilling picture. Charlie wasn't losing control on his own. He was being maneuvered, and then the leaks hit social media. Clips of Charlie hesitating mid-sentence. Moments where his laughter sounded forced. Pauses that hinted at exhaustion. Fans initially brushed it off. "He's tired," they said. "He's stressed," but as Joe highlighted patterns, as multiple insiders confirmed behaviors that matched his observations, the public slowly started to grasp the scale of the manipulation. The shock didn't just ripple, it cascaded. What looked like marital tension was actually an elaborate psychological campaign. One that Joe said had layers even experts might struggle to fully map. The most haunting revelations came from sources claiming direct evidence of Charlie trying to confront Erika about her behavior. Not arguments, not fights, conversations that were careful, deliberate, trying to uncover truth without triggering retaliation. According to these accounts, Erika responded with rehearsed defenses, almost robotic inconsistency. When pressed, she issued cryptic warnings. "You don't understand what's at stake," she would say. Or, "If you push too hard, you'll regret it." Joe described these as the first moments where Charlie realized this was bigger than a personal conflict. This was strategic, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. Then came the recordings. One insider shared files Charlie secretly created, documenting conversations, timestamps, and anomalies. The audio revealed Erika repeating phrases, hesitating, and correcting herself in ways that suggested direction from a third party. Joe emphasized that these weren't the ravings of a troubled partner, they were signals of a psychological operation. Each nuance, each micro-behavior confirmed what insiders had been saying for months. Charlie wasn't failing as a husband or public figure. He was being undermined systematically, and just when Joe was laying out these findings, he hinted at the ultimate twist. The orchestrator behind Erika wasn't just manipulating a personal relationship. According to whistleblowers, there were signs that the same methods had been applied to others' friends, colleagues, and perhaps even political figures connected to Charlie. Every staffer, every insider, every anonymous message painted the same picture. This wasn't isolated. It was a network. A web of influence, surveillance, and psychological control that extended far beyond what anyone could initially imagine. By the end, Joe's commentary wasn't just a breakdown of Erika and Charlie. It became an expose of a sophisticated manipulation machine. Every anecdote, every recording, every observation pointed to a single, unsettling truth: Charlie's collapse wasn't natural. It was engineered. His mistakes weren't mistakes, they were designed moments to destabilize him. His fear wasn't fear, it was a calculated response. And as Joe repeatedly told his audience, the question wasn't whether this was happening, it was how deep it went, who else was involved, and whether anyone could escape once caught in the system. Charlie's final months, as Joe framed them, were no longer just tragic. They were a warning, a demonstration of how influence, control, and subtle manipulation could dismantle even the strongest public figure without anyone noticing until it was too late. And as the audience digested every detail, the tension was palpable. Because if Charlie could be targeted this way, Joe warned, anyone could, and that realization made every new leak, every insider tip, every observation even more chilling. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, the full scope of the scandal waiting to unfold. And the world was left questioning who survives when someone like JS is orchestrating events from the shadows. Who can even recognize the strings before they're pulled? And who, if anyone, can stop them? So now you see why this isn't just another headline, another celebrity drama to scroll past. This is bigger, much bigger. Charlie wasn't failing. Erika wasn't unstable by accident. And the man behind it all, JS, wasn't just playing games. He was orchestrating a system, a network of control, influence, and fear that manipulated not one, but multiple lives. And if Charlie could be dismantled without anyone noticing, what does that say about the rest of us? About who might already be caught in his web? This is where you come in. We need to ask the hard questions. Who else has been targeted? How far does this reach? And most importantly, how do we expose it before it claims another life? Don't just sit there scrolling. Comment below with your theories. Who do you think JS is? How do you think he managed to manipulate Erika so perfectly? Could Joe Rogan survive this unscathed, or is he already being watched? Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because part 2 is coming, and trust me, it's going to get even more dangerous. Share this video with everyone you know. The more eyes on this story, the harder it becomes for JS to stay hidden. Stay alert, stay skeptical, and stay engaged, because in this story, nobody is safe and the truth won't wait.